Okay. So hi, welcome to AI in academic research. My name is John Gage. I am the IT librarian with the University Libraries Archives at Emporia State University. Basically, today will be kind of a guide on how AI works and how it can be used for academic research ethically. So first off, we're going to start with ChatGPT because that's the big one and everybody's heard of it or at least knows of it. The version we are using is the 3.5 version today. That's the free version. There are extra updates to ChatGPT like 4.0, which they claim has less what they call hallucinations. And what that means is that basically the AI makes something up, is what happens when something hallucinates. So when something hallucinates, it basically makes an extrapolation. It's kind of like when you decide based on reasoning and logic that something should be true. So if you think about it, the data the um, AI uses says something like, "Oh, I see all IT librarians are redheads." That's just because it has data to show that. It doesn't necessarily mean that's completely true. So AI does have potentials to think like humans, but it also has the same logical errors. So hallucinations will pop up based on those reasoning. And with that, we'll kind of start diving into AI with ChatGPT. So first thing I like to do when I look at an AI is kind of figure out what's going on with it and how it works, because every single AI is going to be a little different. So let's say my research is physics, right? I want to know something about physics. So I'm going to go in and ask it about quantum physics fields. So it's going to generate a response for that, right? And based on its responses, you can kind of see two different things. The first one I look at is I said quantum physics fields. So I was looking more at the disciplines within quantum physics. Well, ChatGPT doesn't give me that. ChatGPT decided to give me things like electromagnetic fields, gravitational fields, fields of certain parts in physics, right? Higgs field. So it just find all of these things for me. First thing I notice is it doesn't really give me any citations on what the data came from. That's the first thing I look at and say, okay, maybe I need to ask where it's getting its information from. The second thing I notice in ChatGPT is over here, I have a response button. And basically, what that means for an AI is that if you can provide feedback, you can change the algorithm. Well, great. What does that algorithm do? The algorithm's just a function that says, oh, I need to do better next time. This wasn't the expected response I wanted. So I have influence on that. So to me, that shows me that if I have influence and I'm not a professional in the field, maybe the data that's using and how the algorithm learns isn't exactly something that's reliable. So if I come back here and regenerate a response, I can see that it's generating somewhat the same answer. But when we get down to the next step here, it actually shows me a better or worse response or same. With that, it indicates that not only can I regenerate multiple answers to the same topic or same question, but now I can influence the algorithm even more. So it's not like a professional is going in there and peer reviewing a journal article from a database. It's whoever has access to this can now click, yes, this was better, or yes, this was worse, or it was the same. With that, we can kind of start to see how this will shape up. So now I need to answer my next question. How does ChatGPT actually know what it's responding with, right? So I'm going to send in the same question I had before, but with citations and sources. right? And now you see that it's actually providing some sources for it. Okay. So this is one way ChatGPT can be useful for research because it can provide extra resources that you might not know about or might not find through a database. However, one thing I am noticing is a lot of these are from the 2000s or maybe earlier. And obviously, if you have gravitational fields, you don't necessarily have to have something brand new, but it's giving me an insight into how the database is created. And so, with that, I kind of want to show you an example I already have planned. So, I asked ChatGPT earlier about giving me articles on certain topics. Well, if you look at this one, it says a list of articles on neurodivergence. It says it's only been updated since January 2022. So anything newer doesn't exist in the database, right? So this is something you have to keep in mind when you're working with AI is figuring out what data it's using. And so for this one, it tells me that it's not using current things from 2003 and 2004. So, and also it blocks it from its capabilities, right? But you notice when I generated topics on quantum physics, it didn't block you, it didn't tell you anything. So there's a trick that the AI is kind of doing, saying, I can provide you information if it's an acceptable subject for the AI to handle. So it feels that quantum physics is fine, but something else like neurodivergence is not, right? And so it can say, a list of general topics that you can look at. So while it didn't provide us with the exact sources or journal articles, it provided us with some topics. So it's a good way to use kind of as a last resort if you're stuck, but it's not just for um, blocking other things. If you notice here, if I talk about searching for social Darwinism through ChatGPT, it will provide me with answers, but it never says anything like it did at the front of this one, where it says, my last update was January 2022. So that data is non-existent. So if you look at the bottom, it doesn't say anything here. It also always says at the bottom, ChatGPT makes mistakes. Consider checking important information, right? So what good does ChatGPT do for us in academic searching if it's not necessarily giving us correct information? Like I said, it's a great last resort if you're struggling to find something. Maybe you need different topics, or if you're struggling to understand a topic. One thing I do like to do is go into ChatGPT and go through and say something like, explain something to me like I'm five, right? So explain quantum mechanics to me. So it'll provide an explanation, and you can also say, explain it like I'm a college student. So you can get multiple references to things. But remember, you're always having to cite your sources and check your information. And this is something that's a little different from looking at a peer-reviewed journal, possibly in our databases or EBSCO discovery. And with that, there's one other thing you need to look at when you're starting to deal with AI, and that's the ethics around AI. So for ChatGPT, there's been a lot of issues around Sam Altman, the CEO of ChatGPT and OpenAI, even stated AI doesn't exist without copyrighted material. Well, how is AI getting its data resources? Is it resourced ethically? Obviously, there's been lawsuits from the New Yorker, New York Times. Sarah Silverman's done a lawsuit against ChatGPT for using their um, writing styles and other things like that for plagiarism, right? So if you look at OpenAI, they don't necessarily explain what data they're using, right? Nowhere in here does it say that there's any data that it's using. But if you go into OpenAI itself and start to dig through OpenAI, there's not much here as far as what data is being used. So that's one concern is you don't necessarily understand where the data is coming from or how it's sourced. because it's not just the computer biases or misinterpreting information, it's also the ethically generated data and content that it's using. And with that, you can kind of see that even throughout here, there's no specific link to what the data is doing. And even with the research, you can look into the API overview and documentation. There's nothing really stating that there is ethically sourced data. So that would be one problem, right? So ethically, you can't necessarily use ChatGPT for um, just straight up content creation. The next one we're going to kind of explore now is Google Gemini. This used to be called Google Bard. Um, it's a lot more restrictive in its AI searching. So it still works kind of the same. Like I said before, we'll just do quantum physics in here just to show an example. So it's going to generate something. Okay. But notice how it's completely different. It only mentions a few things. It's not a classical list. So even though I put the same input into Google Gemini, it gave me a completely different type of response. The other thing I noticed is you notice how you have the plus or minus here, like normal, but there's no option to regenerate. And that's because it's actually up here with show drafts. And so back to the way ChatGPT kind of looked, it gave you some different types of quantum fields. Same thing here. And this one even decided to give me an image. I'm not sure what the image is, but we can kind of look at it. So I just clicked on an image and it actually popped up to a source. So this gives me an idea of where information is coming from the AI. So it pulled it from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy from Stanford. Okay, but what if we ask the exact same question, but with citing sources, right? And it even also mentions Wikipedia at the bottom of that article. So AI might not necessarily be using the most reliable sources too, if it's using Wikipedia. But now that I have sources and citations, I'm starting to see different things here. So we see Steve Weinberg, famous physicist. Um, we now see the online reference source used for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. We also see that it doesn't necessarily say anything about online lectures. It just says that. And then it just gives a citation style. So it really doesn't provide us with much information on this draft. And as you notice here, it provides us with Wikipedia for the online resource. And same here. So really, when you're trying to dig through what AI is using, sometimes it's a lot harder to figure out where it's coming from. Luckily, Gemini actually tends to provide us with more information. Unfortunately, it's not very reliable, right? It's not providing us with a great source, even though some of it might match what ChatGPT is saying. So with that, we can kind of see there are similarities in that it uses a lot of open resources. And now we're kind of going to go on to the next version of this, which you'll see a lot more, which is basically being searching through Copilot. And Copilot's now on Windows computers. It's now kind of in that beta phase, but it's also going to be a new keyboard button, right? So let's play around with Copilot. So if you notice here, you have Copilot uses AI, check for mistakes, obviously, and then you can go through the FAQ. So always make sure you're checking your resources and figuring out where it's coming from, right? And so if we do that, we can kind of start to notice things, but not necessarily in this. If I go to designer, I can see Copilot GPT was used for feedback, right? But if I decide to generate an image, so let's say I want the Last Supper, um, painting done by Picasso, right? So I'm asking it to generate something for me. So I know the Last Supper itself is out of copyright. See, unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily like that, but it still generates images, right? With that, there's a problem though. So if I can click on one of these images, so you can see it's using stable diffusion and open art. And there's already been lawsuits and things against stable diffusion for not paying artists and images. So to me, that's a deal breaker for this AI. It doesn't necessarily provide you with an ethical source for the information. If I click on something else, I might be able to find something from OpenArt AI, right? So that's the same one, stable diffusion. If I click on something else, I can generate another one, right? So it gives me this one instead, but this one's by someone else and it's subject to copyright. So it's not actually creating a real resource now. And so it depends on how it works, right? And so with that, you can generate certain things. If I say I want to design something new, I have to accept the terms of service for this. But let's just say I want a simple graphic design of a panda bear or something. So now it's going to respond to this. And obviously, this continually changes because it's AI. And so what it's going to do is it will only generate if you have an account. So I'm going to sign in by Dolly 3. And to me, that screams OpenAI because that is what is being used for OpenAI. So with that, you can see an image generation. Yet again, there's the copyright and legal ethics of how AI produces its information. So here you go. You can do another designer and change it, or it provides you with other information. But for the idea of creating a template or getting design-based ideas, you're not using this for selling ideas and things like that. So there are some ethical ways in which you can use AI. However, designing things isn't necessarily the best type of idea because of the way it's generated, and the same with drawing and writing content. So if I ask for a list of quantum mechanics fields or something like that, quantum physics fields. So notice it's giving me very close and very similar answer to what ChatGPT uses. The other thing it does is it actually starts to reference resources a little bit better than ChatGPT does. So give it a second. So it provides this, and then give it a second. It'll actually build up the list, right? And so it's actually playing a video. So it does basic search for me. But if I click on the resources here, yet again, it brings me back to Wikipedia, which is not necessarily a reliable resource, right? And so for your general AI, these wide AI, as they're known as, they don't really give you a accurate academic source to use. Well, great. What good does AI do me then? The idea is there are other things that you can use for AI, and they're a little more what we call narrow AI or something focused on a specific task. One of these happens to be called Research Rabbit. So Research Rabbit is a program that kind of links up articles and makes it easy to display and search. It provides a graphic review and gives you stuff like abstracts. So for this one, I showed an example of paper on AI and generation with ChatGPT 4. So it gives me the paper that I've selected. It can view similar work. So the nice thing about this is it provides visualization. As you can see here, I can have abstracts, get rid of the comments, and then it can give me new articles by people. And so it provides you with a quicker, rapid research type of thing. It can provide you with all the citations. So if you're looking for an article and you can get the citations, it'll actually bring you to the papers itself, right? It can also suggest authors. But this is more data scraping than it is necessarily building a full AI. It's just able to link things quickly together. So if I pick these authors and I pick a work, notice how it doesn't show me some publications because some of them actually don't have sources. So that's another problem is you don't necessarily know if it's pulling up the correct information. However, if I pull up similar work, I can now go through and see about finding where this is coming from, right? So with that, we'll go over here. So now it's actually using a reference resource that we have here at ESU of PubMed. So this one, you can cite the DOI and it gives you the abstract, or you can get the full TINKS link. But at least this gives you a place to start, right? This AI is a great starting point if you get stuck or your last resort. So you can take this DOI number or find these authors and then plug them into our database at ESU and see if we have access to it, or you can request access through interlibrary loan. And it's not just AI papers and it's not just PubMed. So here we go. I have one done by a different author. So I can see that it's referenced, but I can see all citations. So here's the references. And like we saw before, Weinberg from ChatGPT, we can also see newer things, right? So if I go back to this paper, I can get another one. And so you can just kind of keep going down rabbit holes, no pun intended, for finding information. So it does make it quicker and easier, both visually and just searching through basic texts. So one thing you will have to do is verify all the research is done and that the article linking is correct. With that, there becomes an issue as well of confirmation biases and biases in the algorithm itself. As you notice here, I don't necessarily have the plus or minus, right? There's no way I can actually influence the algorithm. So this one's going to be a little more stable of an AI. To me, that means that it's going to be better to use. It's going to be more consistent because in the cases with ChatGPT, and others, the reason I have these saved here was because sometimes ChatGPT will just go down because the data in the learning model collapses. A lot of AI has done that in the past. ChatGPT has done that. Um, Microsoft had a Tay AI for Twitter that actually was collapsed within 8 hours and they had to take it down. So there are issues with those updated models and learning. So something that's a little more what they call narrow or basically singular task or makes task either easier and less repetitive is a kind of a better fit. Yet again, you still want to go through here and make sure it's being used ethically, that they have access to the articles that they're using, right? And so for this one, I can look here and see if this one's okay. So this one's from Elsevier and Science Direct. So it's using a little bit more of what you expect from an academic research perspective. It's using journal articles, it's pulling from different resources. When I've tried this before, it's pulled from open source data, not just PubMed, but also like PLOS One and various other sources. So it's kind of nice just for looking at papers and kind of getting a link. Now, with that, you won't necessarily get the variety of authors, though, that you might with a database search. So that's another concern you might have is getting different sources and different perspectives. Because while this is nice, I can add a new paper if I wanted to. You can look here that it can connect to Zotero like we want. So if you're building bibs out of Zotero, you can do that. For this one, we'll just say, so I need to do this. So notice I can do biomedical and life sciences or just all subject areas. So for this one, I'm going to add this one to my collection so I can start to build kind of a repository of searches, which is nice. And so here I can see I have something new. So I have one selected paper and I have all my citations with this author, right? And so you just keep going down that. And if you want to, you can export the papers as a CSV, which is kind of nice. So I'll just have a CSV ready to go with my research rabbit. So with that, we also have another type of AI as well. This one's called Cite. And so this one is paid for. So this is the test version here. So we'll click in something like how does the structure of protein affect its function? So this one will provide you with um, basic resources and build you out kind of a little explanation for something. However, I do want to be careful when recommending this one. It's nice that it pulls the references up, but through my testing, I've noticed that it doesn't actually pull in the correct data here, and the references aren't always correct. So it might say it has 12 references in your citation for your explanation that you're looking for, or for the papers that you need to use, but it actually will only use six of them. So the good thing is you can always view full text and actually see where your information is coming from. Again, you can see this view publications consulted. This one provides you with a little bit more data on what's going on, which is kind of nice to see. So as you notice here, I have publications consulted. So it actually looked through 42 publications apparently. But as you notice, I only have about five or six through the paper. So it's kind of nice for quickly building resources to find and search through. But remember, again, it's not something that you can use to actually write your paper, right? Because you can't trust it to build out a full paper and then have the correct work cited. It's not trustworthy and it's not ethical to do so. But it does at least give us somewhere to start looking at different article options for that topic. Then we have Paper Digest, which is also kind of like the other two that we just saw. So I can ask a question or I can do literature review. So I'll just ask a question for this example here. So it gives you all areas. And so I can ask a research question, right? So I'm going to go through and look for quantum physics fields. And the main reason I'm doing this one is because what I've noticed with this AI is it uses a lot of original and older sources. So if you notice here, then this one's actually surprising because usually it doesn't give me 2019. But notice it also gives me the ability to feedback. So it's not quite as trustworthy as other AI or Research Rabbit, right? Because this one's pulling together a bunch of resources, it's citing it, but you don't necessarily know if they're quality or not. And also notice down here, it also quotes Wikipedia, right? These are all things you have to be aware of while working with AI, and every single one's going to show it slightly differently. But the more and more you get used to searching with AI and using AI, it becomes easier to track down those little details and issues that don't really give AI credence for generating answers. Um, with that, I can do something like um, articles on quantum physics. And this one will give me something a little different. So now it got rid of Wikipedia as my top articles down here, which is good, but it doesn't necessarily fix the problem, right? So literature review. Now I'll try this one. So notice it's still summarizing, but it's using a lot more um, related works to it. So even through this, it gives me older articles than before. So even though I'm asking it the exact same question, I'm getting two different response results. And that's not due to the regeneration, right? They're actually literature review and questions. So keeping that in mind, um, make sure you know what you're doing with the AI first, right? With this, I just want a list of resources that might be useful. So this one provides me with a list, and then it kind of summarizes up the field itself, which is what I originally wanted when I started this journey, right? I went to ChatGPT and it just gave me a list of things. Now here's finally the review of it and kind of condensing it down, but that doesn't necessarily mean this review is correct. So you'd actually have to go back through and verify every single source in here, right? And with that, we can go on to the one of the few other ones here, and that's consensus. So this one will do the same thing. So this one's built just for finding research papers. Um, so you do need a count sometimes on some of these, but otherwise you can type in different things. So I'm just going to sign in with Google. I should already have an account. Okay. And so basically here, it's now provided me with results. So the two things I've noticed is it says yes, your question, this paper leads yes. So right now it's trying to help me determine what papers are useful in searching. So with that, I can't necessarily guarantee that these are the correct sources, right? It also states that it's highly cited. Well, what does that actually mean, right? So with this, this leads me to think that there's some extra biases on top of this AI, but it does provide me with articles to research and look at. So here it kind of gives me the abstract, just like you would expect from things like Research Rabbit or just looking it up in EBSCO databases. And so from here, you can check the full text if it exists. One thing I noticed is it also has Semantic Scholar attached to it, right? And then it's Applied Journal of Physiology. And there we go. You can do that with multiple different types of resources. The other thing I've noticed is through using one of these, it really depends on how you phrase your question. So that means that if you're doing academic research and spending the time looking through these, try different ways of formulating your search for the research papers, not for content generation, right? So obviously this one's pre-built to be a good example for the site. And with that, there's one other one that you can kind of do, which is kind of like Research Rabbit, but if I want to type in something like, so this one's actually going to build me a graph, right? And use the graph. So I can do science mapping software. So I'm just going to look at an example here. This looks just like Research Rabbit. It's just a slightly different version of it, right? So now I still have to go back through and verify that whatever's in this search is useful. I'm noticing it's using Semantic Scholar and things like that. So with that, I kind of want to bring it back to the idea that while Chat GPT and all these AIs can be used for research, one thing I want to highlight is that I really think AI is still kind of in its infancy for AI and academic research. I think it's a great place to start understanding AI as far as getting used to using AI, but it's also a good place when you're stuck and giving you additional options that you might not be thinking about or different search terms. So even though I did want quantum physics, I can still go back into one of the more generic AIs or wide AIs and ask the same question, right? Um, Instead of asking for quantum physics fields, what are some topics in quantum physics, right? And this is another problem you might see with AI. So I'm going to bring up a new search here and notice something happened when it didn't regenerate the response. See, it still can't regenerate a response. And this is something you need to be aware of with AI. So we're going to try it in Gemini and see what it gives here. So this gives me at least some ideas and topics to start on. So if you're blanking out on writing a topic, this is a really great resource. And remember to always check some of the drafts and also verify the data that you're using. And with that, I'm going to end the recording here and then open it up for questions. So give me 1 second to stop the recording.